Gong, Jiang, Tang, Cha, Gun, Gao. It may come as a surprise, but all of these terms may have been borrowed from the languages of ancient Southeast Asia. These languages would have been spoken by the ancestors of the modern day Vietnamese people, Khmer people, Hmong people, and many other groups. To put this issue into context, there have been countless papers and books written about the Chinese loanwords in languages like Korean, Japanese, Vietnamese, and Thai. Even most laymen and everyday people are at least somewhat aware of the legacy that these loanwords have had on their native languages. And in the case of the Vietnamese people, the initiation of Chinese domination over what is now northern Vietnam technically predates the existence of the Vietnamese language, as classified by linguists, which demonstrates the sheer impact the Old and Middle Chinese languages had on Southeast Asia. However, not as much discussion has occurred about Chinese borrowing words from Southeast Asian languages. Most of these borrowings would have happened thousands of years ago, so they are quite difficult to detect without the use of the imperative method and reconstructions as a whole. And the ancient Southeast Asian languages would be practically unrecognizable to speakers of modern day Southeast Asian languages, thereby adding to the difficulty. Hence, the purpose of this video is to illustrate such loanwords. For some context about the language families, most modern Chinese dialects are descended from Middle Chinese. Middle Chinese and the modern Min dialects are then directly descended from what is known as Old Chinese. From there, Old Chinese is descended from Proto-Sino-Tibetan, the ancestral language of all Sino-Tibetan languages, including Burmese and Tibetan. As for Vietnamese, despite the large amount of Chinese loanwords, it is a member of a separate language family, Austroasiatic. Along with Khmer, a fellow Austroasiatic language, it is one of the modern languages that are ultimately descended from Proto-Austroasiatic, with there being intermediate stages, of course. In addition, languages like Thai and Lao are members of the Kredai language family, while languages such as White Hmong and Yu Mian are members of the Hmong Mian language family. Now, before we examine the list of loanwords, I'd like to discuss some caveats. First, these etymologies are ultimately tenuous. As stated before, these word transfers would have occurred more than 2,000 years ago and before a substantial literary record was established between the Chinese and Southeast Asian populations, in the aftermath of Imperial China's conquest of what is now southern China and northern Vietnam. Additionally, I would like to emphasize that I am fortunately non-expert in the reconstructed languages of ancient Asia, like Proto-Sino-Tibetan or Proto-Austroasiatic, so please forgive my pronunciation of the terms from these languages. And for the etymology diagrams, which you'll see later, keep in mind that many of the intermediate steps have been omitted for the sake of space and time. Another caveat is that this video focuses heavily on the Austroasiatic languages, especially when it comes to Vietnamese. Such a focus is because I'm far more familiar and comfortable with the Vietnamese language than the other languages of Southeast Asia. It would have been ideal to give equal focus to each of the language families, albeit that would be difficult considering that Southeast Asia is arguably the most linguistically diverse region of the world, besides Oceania. Lastly, within the Austroasiatic languages, there's simply much more information on Vietnamese and Khmer, so there will be an emphasis on these two languages. It should be noted that there are dozens of other Austroasiatic languages, so choosing just Vietnamese and Khmer is not comprehensive, to say the least. That being said, let us proceed. So for this list, I would like to begin by clarifying that for my etymology diagrams, I'll be marking word transfers with a red arrow, while I'll be marking the direct descent of vocabulary, as in natural evolution within a language, with a black arrow. Hence, let us now finally introduce the first word. So the first character that we'll be looking at is the Chinese character for son or child in the Min Chinese dialects. It comes from Proto-Austroasiatic, in which it was possibly pronounced as Guang or Guang. It eventually became Gran in Old Chinese, and then it has the modern Chinese forms of, depending on which dialect you speak, it may be like Gyang or Gyan. The equivalent in the modern Austroasiatic languages would actually be Gong in modern Vietnamese, and then Gong in modern Khmer. Next, we have the Chinese character for bow. It was borrowed from the Proto-Austroasiatic term gong, which meant curved or bent. The Old Chinese term would then be guang or guong, which would become gyung in Middle Chinese. From this term, Mandarin has the word gong, which means bow. Note that the Middle Chinese term itself was borrowed into Vietnamese, with the modern Vietnamese word being gum as in bow. However, there also exists the modern Vietnamese word gom as in curved, and the modern Khmer form Guang or Guang, which are themselves directly descended from the original a Proto-Austroasiatic form and have the same meaning. For our third character, we have one of the Chinese characters for river. It was borrowed from the Proto-Austroasiatic term rung that meant river, from which the Proto-Sino-Tibetan form would be kliung, klung, kliuk, or kluk. The Old Chinese term would then be krong, which would then become kaung in Middle Chinese. From this term, Mandarin has the word jiang, which means river in certain contexts. Note that the Middle Chinese term was itself borrowed into Vietnamese, with the modern Vietnamese word being yang, which is Sino-Vietnamese for river. However, the Vietnamese word sham, as in river, is a direct descendant of the original Proto-Austroasiatic term, thereby making this word a cognate of the aforementioned terms. Funnily enough, the character for port was also borrowed from the Proto-Austroasiatic term rung that meant river. The difference shows up by Old Chinese, with the term being krong, which has a glottal stop, whereas the previous term did not. From this term, the Middle Chinese term would be kaung, so a rising tone. This word would become gang in Mandarin, which means port. Note that the Middle Chinese term was itself borrowed into Vietnamese, with the modern Vietnamese word being gang, which is the Vietnamese term for a port. And just like yang, the word gang is actually the cognate of the word sham, which is the general way to say river in modern Vietnamese. For our fifth character, we have one of the Chinese characters for street or road. This character was also the name of one of China's greatest imperial dynasties, so it may come as a surprise to hear that this term may have been borrowed from an ancient Southeast Asian language. But the theory is indeed that Old Chinese borrowed this term from Proto Austroasiatic, in which the form was glong. This term would be pronounced in Old Chinese as either glong, rang, rang, or rang. From here, the Middle Chinese form would be tang, which would become tang in Mandarin, and deung in Vietnamese, due to the latter's borrowing of the Middle Chinese term. Within the modern Austroasiatic languages, there is evidence that the modern Khmer word Hon Long is a descendant of the original Proto-Austroasiatic form. Another character that corresponds to the meaning of road is the character lu. Old Chinese borrowed this term from the Proto-Austroasiatic form kra, meaning road or way, with the word being pronounced in Old Chinese like kraks or kraks. The Middle Chinese form would somehow turn out to be lu, with a departing or a falling tone. This form would become lu in Mandarin and lo in Vietnamese because the latter borrowed it from Middle Chinese. However, there does exist within Vietnamese a direct descendant of the Proto-Austroasiatic form, for that word being sha. This word is an obsolete way to refer to roads and paths, and it only exists as a fixed morpheme in expressions such as đường sha. Now, the seventh character is a Chinese character for elder sister. The theory is that Old Chinese borrowed this term from Proto-Monic, which is a descendant of Proto-Austroasiatic. It would become zi in Middle Chinese, so if a rising tone, and it would eventually become zi or jie in modern Mandarin. Note that the Middle Chinese term was also brought into Vietnamese to give rise to the modern Vietnamese term jie, which has the same meaning and can be used as a pronoun. For our eighth Chinese character, we have the character for tiger. Proto-Sino-Tibetan most likely borrowed the term from the Proto-Austroasiatic form klach. Eventually, it would become the Old Chinese form of krach or klach. The Middle Chinese form would turn out to be Khuh, so with a rising tone, which would not only give rise to the modern Mandarin form Hu, but also to the Vietnamese word Ho. However, in certain North Central dialects of Vietnamese, there does exist a direct descendant of the original Proto-Austroasiatic form, which would be Khai, which means tiger in these dialects. Another direct descendant within the modern Austroasiatic languages would be the modern Khmer word for tiger, which is kla. And for the ninth Chinese character, we have the character for cloth or fabric. It comes from the Proto-Austroasiatic term bas, which would be borrowed into Old Chinese to become bas or bas. This would become pu in Middle Chinese, so with a falling tone. The Mandarin word would be bu, while Vietnamese brought this term from Middle Chinese, with the Vietnamese version being bo. However, there also exists a direct descendant of the original Proto-Austroasiatic form, with that word being vai, not to be confused with lychee, of course. For our 10th Chinese character, we have the character for tea. Although it may be shocking to hear, considering that tea is so associated with China, It is not actually a term that is native to the Sino-Tibetan language family. In fact, it comes from the Proto-Austroasiatic term slah, meaning leaf, and it was borrowed into Proto-Sino-Tibetan as slah. From there, it would be pronounced as la in Proto-Loloish, from which Old Chinese would borrow the word to become la. Eventually, it would become dra in Middle Chinese, then becoming cha in modern Mandarin. As for Vietnamese, the word ja originates from its borrowing of the Middle Chinese term, and one of its cognates is actually the Vietnamese word "chè", referring to a kind of dessert in Vietnamese cuisine. And it is also a loanword here, and it is what is known as a non Sino Vietnamese reading of the character, meaning that it comes from a different context than the usual borrowings. But what are the direct descendants of the Proto Austroasiatic form then? For Vietnamese, that will be the word la, which still means leaf to this day. And for Khmer, it would be slek, which is far more phonologically conservative than its Vietnamese cognate. For our 11th Chinese character, we have one of the characters that means boat, with this term having a more literary connotation than chuan. Old Chinese may have borrowed this term from Proto-Austroasiatic, in which the form was lok. The Old Chinese form of to or tio would become jiu in Middle Chinese, which would then become jiao in modern Mandarin. And as for the modern Austroasiatic cognates, there exists the Vietnamese word nop or nok, which is used in some Central Vietnamese dialects to mean a small boat. Meanwhile, in modern Khmer, there exists the word tok, which can mean boat or canoe. For our 12th Chinese character, we have the Chinese character for root or foundation. Funnily enough, this character has two possible Proto-Austroasiatic origins. First, it may come from the Proto-Austroasiatic form the ker, meaning tree or plant. It would be borrowed into Old Chinese to become ger or gun, which would then become gon in Middle Chinese. In the modern era, the Mandarin form would be gan, while Vietnamese brought the Middle Chinese term to have the term gang, which is associated with the meanings of source or origin. But for the direct descendant of Proto-Austroasiatic, that would be the Vietnamese word gai, still meaning tree or plant. The alternative theory is that the character instead comes from the Proto-Austroasiatic form the gal or the gal, which means stump or trunk. It will be borrowed into Old Chinese as ger or gun. The rest of the theory is the same as the first theory from this point on, with the exception that there may exist another direct descendant of the Proto-Austroasiatic form, with that word being the Khmer term gual, which does mean stump or trunk in the modern day language. For our 13th Chinese character, we have one of the characters for dog. Old Chinese borrowed this term from Proto-Hmong Mien, for which the form was Khuh. Old Chinese would then pronounce this term as kro or ko, which would then become Khuh in Middle Chinese, so if a rising tone. Afterwards, it would eventually become Gao in Mandarin. And as for the modern Hmong Mien languages, the white Hmong cognate would be the, so with a rising tone. Note that the character chuan in Chinese is most likely the native form of dog in the Chinese language. Lastly, we have a Chinese character that means temple. The Proto-Hmong Mien form was pro and would be borrowed into Old Chinese as mraus or mraus. It would become miao in Middle Chinese, so with a falling tone, and then miao in modern Mandarin. And since the Middle Chinese term was borrowed into Vietnamese, the modern Vietnamese form would be miu. And as for the modern Hmong Mien languages, the white Hmong cognate would be je, so with a rising tone. So, in conclusion, these are some of the Chinese words that are borrowed from a variety of ancient Southeast Asian languages. Overall, the words are related to a wide set of topics, meaning that there was mostly a decent amount of exposure between the ancient populations that made these borrowings far more likely. But regardless of these socio-historical implications, it is still cool to see how Southeast Asia influenced the Chinese language in the past. I hope you enjoyed the video, and be sure to like and subscribe if you want more future content like this. Thank you.